On the morning of December 8th, 1941, at 0650 hours, Private First Class Guy McGee crouched behind his 50 caliber Browning machine gun on Wake Island's coral shore, watching 36 Japanese bombers materialize through the morning haze like a swarm of mechanical locusts. At 23 years old, he was a civilian contractor who had volunteered for weapons training just 2 weeks earlier, now facing an enemy that had already devastated Pearl Harbor the day before. His training consisted of 8 hours spread across 3 afternoons, learning to disassemble, name the parts, and reassemble the M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun without any pieces left over. The Marine instructor, Sergeant Henry Bedell, had told him the weapon could fire at 600 rounds per minute and punch through aircraft engines at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, but nobody had explained what it felt like to aim at aircraft moving at 200 miles per hour while bombs exploded around your position. McGee's machine gun was one of only 18 50 caliber weapons protecting the entire atoll, positioned among 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns that had just a single working fire control director among them. The Marines defending Wake Island numbered 449, exactly 1/3 of the force needed to properly man the defensive positions that Admiral Husband Kimmel had originally envisioned for the strategic outpost. They had no radar, no air search capability, and no way to detect incoming aircraft until they appeared on the horizon. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese attack began at 0658, just hours after receiving word that Pearl Harbor had been bombed on the other side of the international date line. The Mitsubishi G3M3 medium bombers, flying from bases in the Marshall Islands, approached at 12,000 feet in perfect formation, their synchronized movements reflecting months of training for this moment. They carried 800-kilogram bombs designed to destroy airfields, hangars, and any aircraft caught on the ground. McGee had been trained to lead the target, aiming ahead of the aircraft's flight path to allow for the bullet's travel time. At a range of 1,500 yards, the 50 caliber round would take approximately 1.5 seconds to reach a bomber flying at cruising speed, during which time the aircraft would have traveled nearly 500 feet. The mathematics were complex, but his instructor had simplified it. Aim 3 aircraft lengths ahead and adjust based on tracer rounds. The distinctive roar of the M2 Browning filled the morning air as McGee pressed his thumbs against the butterfly trigger, sending streams of half-inch diameter bullets arcing toward the enemy formation. Each round weighed 750 grains and traveled at 2,800 feet per second, carrying kinetic energy sufficient to penetrate aircraft aluminum at ranges that would make rifle fire completely ineffective. The weapon's recoil was substantial, but the 38-pound barrel assembly and 84-pound gun mount absorbed most of the shock. The psychological reality of firing at aircraft was vastly different from the training scenarios McGee had practiced. The targets moved with a speed and fluidity that made precise aiming nearly impossible, while the concussive effects of exploding bombs created a sensory environment that made concentration difficult. He could see his tracer rounds arcing through the sky in brilliant orange streams, but determining whether they were hitting their targets required watching for smoke, flames, or the sudden altitude changes that indicated damage. The first Japanese bomber began trailing smoke at 0704, approximately 6 minutes into the attack. The aircraft maintained formation for another 30 seconds before breaking away and descending toward the ocean, leaving a black contrail that marked its path. McGee never learned whether his bullets had contributed to the kill, as multiple machine gun positions had been firing at the formation simultaneously. The victory was collective, shared among the 1850 caliber positions and the Marine gunners who had opened fire almost immediately after the attack began. Major James Devereux, commanding the Wake Island detachment of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion, had anticipated this moment since arriving on the atoll in August. His defensive plan had always assumed that civilian contractors would augment the Marines in a sudden emergency, and he had authorized voluntary weapons training for anyone willing to learn. Guy McGee was one of approximately 150 to 225 civilians who had enrolled in the impromptu defense school, attending classes while continuing their primary work, constructing the military facilities that would defend the atoll. The transformation of construction workers into anti-aircraft gunners reflected the desperate circumstances facing American forces in the Pacific during late 1941. Wake Island represented the most forward defensive position in the Central Pacific, positioned 2,300 miles west of Hawaii and only 450 miles from the nearest Japanese-controlled territory. The atoll's strategic value lay in its position along shipping and air routes between Hawaii and the Philippines, making it an essential link in America's Pacific defense chain that the Japanese needed to eliminate. By noon on December 8th, the Japanese bombers had destroyed 8 of the 12 Wildcat fighters belonging to Marine Fighter Squadron VMF-211. Caught on the ground during the first raid, 23 Marine personnel were killed in the initial attack, including the squadron's ground crews and maintenance personnel who had been preparing aircraft for the day's patrol missions. The loss of 2/3 of Wake's air defense capability in the first hour of combat demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of the Japanese surprise attack strategy that had already proved successful at Pearl Harbor. The remaining 4 Wildcats, piloted by Marines who happened to be on patrol during the attack, returned to find their base in ruins and their comrades dead or wounded. Major Paul Putnam, commanding VMF-211, immediately organized continuous combat air patrols using the surviving aircraft, knowing that Japanese bombers would return daily until Wake Island fell or reinforcements arrived. His pilots would fly multiple sorties each day, engaging Japanese bombers with 450 caliber machine guns mounted in each Wildcat's wings, supplementing the ground-based anti-aircraft defenses that had already demonstrated their effectiveness during the first raid. The 50 caliber machine guns positioned around Wake Island represented the primary defense against low-level air attacks, as the 3-inch anti-aircraft guns were designed to engage targets at higher altitudes, where their larger shells and longer range provided tactical advantages. The 50 caliber weapons filled the critical gap between 1,500 and 5,000 yards, where the aircraft were vulnerable to machine gun fire, but beyond the effective range of 30 caliber weapons that most infantry units carried. This middle range represented the sweet spot where the M2 Browning's combination of range, hitting power, and rate of fire made it the most effective weapon available for engaging aircraft. The technical specifications of the M2 Browning made it ideally suited for anti-aircraft work. The weapon fired from a closed bolt using a short recoil operation, which provided better accuracy than open bolt designs that tended to shift point of aim when the bolt slammed forward. The adjustable headspace allowed gunners to tune the weapon's timing for optimal reliability in different environmental conditions, while the quick-change barrel design meant that overheated barrels could be replaced in seconds, maintaining sustained fire rates that would cause other weapons to fail. Wake Island's civilian contractors had brought skills from previous massive construction projects, including Boulder Dam, Bonneville Dam, and Grand Coulee Dam. Many were veterans of earlier wars or had previous military experience, making them natural candidates for weapons training when Major Devereux issued his call for volunteers. The men who responded represented a cross-section of American working-class culture in the early 1940s: electricians, carpenters, heavy equipment operators, and general laborers who understood mechanical systems and could adapt quickly to military equipment. Robert Maple, an apprentice electrician, had enrolled in a marine communications course to supplement his technical knowledge. Earl Rowe, a progress photographer documenting the construction work, received 8 hours of practice loading and tracking on a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun. These civilians would prove instrumental in maintaining fire discipline and ammunition supply during the desperate battles that would follow, their industrial experience translating directly to the requirements of sustained combat operations. The Japanese returned at 1100 hours on December 9th with another raid of 18 bombers, targeting the remaining American positions with the same methodical precision that had characterized the first attack. The Marine and civilian gunners responded immediately, having learned from the previous day's combat how to track fast-moving targets and adjust their aim based on observed tracer fire. The 50 caliber positions reported several probable hits on enemy bombers, though the high-altitude formation made damage assessment difficult without observation aircraft to verify results. By December 11th, Wake Island had endured 3 days of continuous bombing that destroyed most of the military facilities and reduced the garrison's combat effectiveness through steady attrition. The Japanese invasion fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka, approached at dawn with 900 special naval landing troops and supporting warships that included cruisers, destroyers, and transports. The Marines watched through the pre-dawn darkness as the enemy vessels materialized from the ocean haze, their silhouettes clearly visible against the lightening eastern sky. Major Devereux had positioned his 6 5-inch coastal defense guns to cover the approaches to Wake Island with overlapping fields of fire, but he had ordered them to hold fire until the Japanese vessels came within effective range. The weapon's obsolescent pieces, originally mounted on the old battleship Texas, could hurl 50-pound shells at 3,150 feet per second to ranges exceeding 17,000 yards. They represented the most powerful weapons available to the defenders, capable of destroying any vessel in Kajioka's invasion fleet if properly employed. The moment that would define Wake Island's defense came at 0615 on December 11th, when the Japanese cruiser Yubari began its third firing run just 4,500 yards offshore. Major Devereux issued his famous command in a dispassionate voice that belied the significance of the moment. "Okay, open fire." The 5-inch guns responded with salvos that struck the leading destroyer Hayate with devastating accuracy, 3 two-gun volleys hitting at a distance of only 4,000 yards so precisely that the vessel exploded, broke in two, and sank immediately. The Marines from Battery L cheered wildly as Hayate disappeared beneath the waves. The first Japanese surface ship sunk during the entire Pacific War. Sergeant Henry Bedell, the same Marine who had trained Guy McGee on the 50 caliber machine gun, hollered at his jubilant gunners, "Knock it off, you bastards, and get back on the guns. What do you think this is, a ball game?" The rebuke reflected the professional discipline that characterized the Marine defenders throughout the siege, maintaining fire control and tactical focus even during moments of triumph. The remaining 4 Wildcat fighters from VMF 211 joined the battle, diving on the retreating Japanese ships with strafing machine gun fire and 100-pound bombs. The pilots pressed their attacks with remarkable courage, flying multiple sorties against an invasion fleet that possessed overwhelming firepower advantage. Their 4 50 caliber wing guns poured thousands of rounds into Japanese vessels that were attempting to withdraw beyond the range of the shore batteries, contributing to the overall defensive victory that forced Admiral Kajioka to abandon his first invasion attempt. The December 11th engagement demonstrated that properly employed 50 caliber weapons could contribute significantly to anti-ship operations when used against lightly armored vessels at close range. The Wildcat fighters' wing guns, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds, proved capable of penetrating destroyer superstructures and starting fires that threatened ammunition storage areas. The psychological effect on Japanese crews was substantial, as they had not anticipated facing aggressive air attacks from an island they believed had been neutralized by 3 days of continuous bombing. The tactical implications of the Wake Island defense rippled throughout the Pacific theater within hours of Admiral Kajioka's withdrawal. American forces, still reeling from the Pearl Harbor disaster, suddenly possessed proof that Japanese invasions could be repelled through aggressive use of available weapons and determined resistance by outnumbered defenders. The propaganda value was immense, providing a morale boost to American forces and civilians who desperately needed evidence that the United States could fight back effectively against Japanese expansion. Japanese commanders immediately recognized that Wake Island would require substantially stronger forces than originally allocated for its capture. The Imperial Japanese Navy rushed reinforcements, including 4 heavy cruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, additional destroyers, and nearly 1,600 more Special Naval Landing Force troops. Admiral Kajioka received authorization to run 6 destroyers aground and commit their crews as infantry if necessary to ensure Wake's capture, reflecting the strategic importance placed on eliminating this symbolic American resistance. The carriers, Soryu and Hiryu, arrived with their air groups on December 22nd, shooting down the last 2 operational Wildcat fighters and eliminating Wake's air defense capability entirely. Without fighter cover, the Marine and civilian gunners manning the 50 caliber positions became the primary defense against Japanese aircraft that now operated with complete freedom over the atoll. The psychological pressure on the gunners intensified as they watched enemy bombers circle lazily overhead, selecting targets without fear of interception. Guy McGee and the other civilian gunners maintained their positions throughout the final Japanese assault that began in the pre-dawn darkness of December the 23rd. Admiral Kajioka, determined to avoid another daylight gunnery duel with the Marines' 5-inch coastal guns, launched his second invasion under cover of darkness with 900 Special Naval Landing troops hitting Wake's south shore. The 50 caliber positions engaged landing barges and infantry attempting to establish beachheads, their tracers marking targets for other defensive weapons in the darkness. The final ground combat on Wake Island involved house-to-house fighting that lasted for 4 hours before Commander Winfield Cunningham, the overall American commander, ordered surrender to prevent further casualties among the outnumbered defenders. The Marines and civilians had inflicted over 800 Japanese casualties while sustaining 120 American deaths, a casualty exchange ratio that reflected the defensive advantages provided by prepared positions and determined resistance. The garrison's performance, particularly the effectiveness of the 50 caliber anti-aircraft weapons against both air and ground targets, would influence American defensive tactics throughout the remaining Pacific campaigns. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The morning of December 7th, 1941, found Mess Attendant 3rd Class Doris Miller gathering laundry aboard the battleship USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor, performing duties that represented one of the few ratings open to black sailors in the segregated United States Navy. At 22 years old, the 6'3", 200-pound former high school football player from Waco, Texas, had proven himself the best heavyweight boxer aboard ship, but military regulations confined his official duties to cooking and serving officers in the wardroom. At 07:55, the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor, initiating a surprise attack that would kill more than 2,400 Americans and plunge the United States into World War II. Miller dropped the laundry he had been collecting and ran to his assigned battle station, an anti-aircraft battery magazine located deep within the West Virginia's hull. When he arrived, he discovered that Japanese torpedoes had already destroyed the position, rendering it completely useless and leaving him without an assigned combat role during the most critical moment of his naval career. Instead of seeking shelter, Miller made his way topside to the bridge, where Captain Mervyn Bennion had been mortally wounded by bomb fragments that had torn through his abdomen. Miller helped move the dying captain to a more protected position, exposing himself to continued enemy fire while rendering aid to an officer who refused to abandon his ship despite wounds that would prove fatal within minutes. The captain's determination to maintain command, even while mortally wounded, exemplified the leadership that inspired sailors throughout the Pacific Fleet during those desperate first hours. After ensuring the captain received medical attention, Miller noticed an unmanned 50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft machine gun positioned near the bridge. He had never received training on the weapon, as Navy regulations prohibited black sailors from operating anti-aircraft guns or receiving gunnery instruction of any kind. The racial barriers that defined military service in 1941 assumed that African Americans lacked the intelligence or temperament for technical combat roles, confining them to support positions regardless of individual capability or courage. Miller grabbed the weapon's handles and began firing at the Japanese aircraft swarming overhead, learning its operation through intuition and desperate improvisation. The water-cooled M2 Browning was more complex than the air-cooled versions used on Wake Island, requiring proper water circulation to prevent barrel overheating during sustained fire. Without training, Miller somehow maintained effective fire discipline, sending streams of 50 caliber rounds toward enemy dive bombers and torpedo planes that were systematically destroying the Pacific Fleet. The ammunition belts feeding the gun held 100 rounds each, requiring frequent reloading that Miller accomplished through observation of nearby gunners and his own mechanical aptitude. Each belt change required releasing the feed mechanism, clearing any jammed rounds, positioning the new belt properly, and cycling the weapon to chamber the first round. Under combat conditions, with explosions rocking the ship and smoke obscuring visibility, the process demanded both technical skill and extraordinary composure. Miller continued firing until he had exhausted all available ammunition for the position, estimated at several hundred rounds spread across multiple belts. Eyewitness accounts from other sailors who observed his actions noted his remarkable accuracy and sustained fire discipline despite complete lack of training. When ordered to abandon his position and assist with evacuating wounded personnel, Miller helped move injured sailors to the upper decks while the West Virginia slowly settled to the harbor bottom, her hull breached by multiple torpedo hits. The broader engagement at Pearl Harbor revealed both the strengths and critical weaknesses of American anti-aircraft defenses on December 7th. Vice Admiral Nagumo's post-attack report stated that after the first 5 minutes, United States anti-aircraft fire became so intense that it effectively negated the element of surprise. However, the Japanese lost only 9 aircraft during the first wave and 20 during the second wave. A total of 29 planes from an attacking force of 350 aircraft. The modest kill rate reflected serious deficiencies in American anti-aircraft weapons rather than any failure of courage or determination by the gunners. The 50 caliber machine guns that formed the primary close-range anti-aircraft defense had effective ranges of approximately 1,500 yards, too short to engage high-altitude bombers and insufficient to create protective barriers around anchored ships. Admiral Kimmel had directed ships in port to maintain a quarter of their 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns manned and ready, anticipating possible air attacks despite the peacetime conditions. This precaution meant that many positions responded almost immediately to the Japanese attack, but their limited range and fire control systems prevented them from inflicting casualties proportional to their volume of fire. The 5-inch anti-aircraft guns mounted on battleships and cruisers possessed sufficient range to engage high-altitude bombers, but they could not elevate enough to counter dive bombers attacking at steep angles. The guns also suffered from slow traverse rates that made tracking fast-moving aircraft extremely difficult, while their fire control systems required manual calculations that lagged behind rapidly changing tactical situations. Additionally, many shells were duds, failing to detonate when they reached the target area and thereby wasting the opportunity to damage or destroy enemy aircraft. The 1.1-inch quad anti-aircraft guns that some cruisers carried proved notoriously jam-prone, frequently malfunctioning during sustained fire and leaving gunners desperately attempting to clear stoppages while under continuous attack. The weapon's complex feeding mechanism and sensitive timing made it unsuitable for the harsh combat environment where reliability mattered more than theoretical performance. Marines and sailors manning these weapons expressed bitter frustration at equipment that failed precisely when needed most. Chief Aviation Ordnance Man John Finn, stationed at the Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay on the opposite side of Oahu from Pearl Harbor, demonstrated the defensive possibilities available to properly trained and positioned gunners. When Japanese aircraft began strafing the air station at 0753, Finn pulled a 50 caliber Browning machine gun from a burning aircraft, mounted it on a portable instruction stand, and began returning fire despite being completely exposed to enemy attacks. He continued fighting for over 2 hours, sustaining multiple wounds while shooting down an estimated number of Japanese aircraft that contributed to his later receipt of the Medal of Honor. The instruction stand that Finn improvised provided only minimal stability compared to purpose-built anti-aircraft mounts, making accurate fire extremely difficult while standing fully exposed to strafing attacks. The fact that he achieved any hits under such conditions testified to both his exceptional gunnery skills and the inherent effectiveness of the 50 caliber weapon when properly employed. His wounds, sustained from multiple strafing passes, reflected the vulnerability of anti-aircraft positions that lacked adequate protection from return fire. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor and Second Lieutenant George Welch, Army Air Corps pilots stationed at Wheeler Field, managed to reach their P-40 fighters at Halewa Auxiliary Airfield and take off during the attack. Each P-40 mounted 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, providing devastating firepower against enemy aircraft when properly employed. The 2 pilots shot down 7 Japanese aircraft between them during multiple sorties, demonstrating that American equipment and training could achieve success when given opportunity to engage on favorable terms. Their first engagement occurred at Barber's Point, where they attacked a formation of 12 Aichi D-3A1 dive bombers, despite facing 6-to-1 odds. Each pilot shot down 1 enemy bomber, but they quickly exhausted their 30 caliber ammunition. They landed at Wheeler Field to rearm, where ground crews reloaded their wing-mounted 50 caliber guns with fresh ammunition belts and sent them back into combat. The second sortie resulted in additional confirmed kills, proving that aggressive tactics and proper ammunition management could overcome numerical disadvantages. The cumulative effect of American anti-aircraft fire during the Pearl Harbor attack totaled 29 Japanese aircraft destroyed and 111 additional planes damaged by ground fire. More than 20 of the damaged aircraft that returned to their carriers were subsequently dumped overboard as too damaged for repair, effectively removing them from Japanese inventory. The actual American defensive success exceeded the commonly cited kill numbers, though the overall tactical situation remained overwhelmingly favorable to the attackers. The Japanese carrier strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor represented the most powerful naval aviation force assembled to that date, with 6 carriers launching coordinated strikes that had never been practiced before December 7th. The Americans mirror-imaged Japanese capabilities, assuming their carriers would operate individually as American doctrine prescribed, and therefore failed to anticipate an attack of such overwhelming scale. This intelligence failure compounded the material deficiencies in anti-aircraft weapons, creating conditions where even effective defensive fire could not prevent catastrophic losses. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor on American military planning was immediate and profound. The obvious inadequacy of 50 caliber machine guns as primary anti-aircraft defense led to crash programs, developing and deploying 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon automatic cannons that could fill the critical gap between 50 caliber and 5-inch weapons. Within 6 months, at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, American ships sprouted these new weapons in large numbers, fundamentally transforming their defensive capabilities. The United States Navy did not lose a single battleship after installing the 1.1-inch, 20mm and 40mm automatic weapons that spelled the difference for the remainder of World War II. The hard lessons learned at Pearl Harbor drove tactical and technical innovations that would save thousands of American lives during subsequent campaigns. The 50 caliber machine guns continued serving as the lightest layer of anti-aircraft defense, supplementing rather than replacing the heavier weapons that provided primary protection against air attack. Doris Miller received the Navy Cross in May 1942, becoming the first African American to earn the Navy's 3rd highest award for gallantry. His citation read, "For distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his own personal safety during the attack on the fleet in Pearl Harbor by Japanese forces on December 7, 1941. While at the side of his captain on the bridge, Miller, despite enemy strafing and bombing, and in the face of a serious fire, assisted in moving his captain, who had been mortally wounded, to a place of greater safety, and later manned and operated a machine gun directed at enemy Japanese attacking aircraft until ordered to leave the bridge. The carefully worded citation avoided specifying how many aircraft Miller might have shot down, reflecting both the difficulty of confirming kills during the chaotic battle and the Navy's institutional discomfort with publicizing that an untrained black sailor had operated weapons more effectively than some formally trained gunners. Nevertheless, Miller's actions became a powerful recruiting tool for African-American enlistment and helped gradually erode the racial barriers that had confined black sailors to support roles. The integration of lessons learned from Wake Island and Pearl Harbor accelerated throughout early 1942 as American forces prepared for defensive operations across the Pacific. The effectiveness of .50 caliber weapons against low-flying aircraft when properly positioned and supplied with adequate ammunition became doctrine, though commanders recognized that these weapons alone could not provide sufficient protection against determined air attacks. The middle layer of anti-aircraft defense required heavier automatic weapons that could engage targets between 1,500 and 5,000 yards. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 demonstrated the evolution of American anti-aircraft doctrine in just 6 months. Ships that had survived Pearl Harbor now bristled with 20mm Oerlikon and 40mm Bofors guns, supplementing their .50 caliber and 5-inch weapons. The layered defense meant that attacking Japanese aircraft faced intense fire at multiple ranges, dramatically increasing the casualties required to achieve successful attacks. Japanese aircraft losses at Midway totaled 320 planes, including many shot down by shipboard anti-aircraft fire that had become far more effective than the defenses available at Pearl Harbor. The Marines who had defended Wake Island spent the remainder of the war in Japanese prisoner camps, enduring brutal conditions that killed approximately 15% of the garrison through starvation, disease, and execution. Guy McGee and the other civilian contractors faced similar treatment, their status as non-combatants, providing no protection from captors who viewed them as legitimate targets. The survivors would carry physical and psychological scars from their captivity that lasted for decades, though nearly 96% of the Wake Marines survived to liberation in August 1945. The tactical lessons from Wake Island's defense influenced Marine Corps doctrine for subsequent amphibious operations throughout the Pacific. The integration of civilian volunteers into defensive operations became formalized in plans for defending other strategic locations where military garrisons were insufficient to man available weapons. The recognition that motivated individuals could learn to operate complex weapons systems with minimal training led to expanded programs bringing technical specialists into combat roles when tactical situations demanded. The .50 caliber Browning machine gun remained in American service throughout World War II and continued serving in subsequent conflicts through Vietnam and beyond. Its reliability, hitting power, and relative simplicity made it the weapon of choice for numerous applications ranging from anti-aircraft defense to vehicle armament. The M2 Browning, designed by John Browning in the 1920s, remained essentially unchanged for nearly a century, testimony to its fundamental soundness and adaptability across different tactical environments. Technical improvements to anti-aircraft fire control systems during World War II gradually reduced the human skill required for effective gunnery. Radar-directed fire control, proximity-fused shells, and improved optical sights meant that later war gunners achieved higher hit rates with less training than the pioneers who had fought at Wake Island and Pearl Harbor. However, the fundamental principle remained constant. Properly positioned and supplied anti-aircraft weapons manned by determined gunners could inflict unacceptable casualties on attacking aircraft, changing the tactical calculations that governed air operations. The strategic significance of the Wake Island and Pearl Harbor defenses extended beyond their immediate tactical results, Japanese commanders learned that American forces would resist aggressively even when outnumbered and outgunned, fighting until ordered to surrender rather than capitulating when faced with overwhelming force. This recognition influenced subsequent Japanese planning, leading to more conservative estimates of forces required to capture defended positions and ultimately contributing to the strategic overextension that doomed their Pacific expansion. The propaganda value of Wake Island's 16-day defense cannot be overstated. American newspapers and radio broadcasts highlighted the Marines' heroic resistance, creating a rallying point for a nation shocked by the Pearl Harbor disaster. The story of outnumbered defenders sinking Japanese ships and shooting down enemy aircraft provided evidence that American fighting men could defeat Japanese forces in direct combat, countering the narrative of Japanese invincibility that had dominated early war reporting. Major James Devereux received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during Wake Island's defense, though he would spend the entire war in Japanese captivity before receiving the award. His careful positioning of available weapons and integration of civilian volunteers into the defensive system demonstrated tactical flexibility that became a model for subsequent defensive operations. The fact that Wake held for 16 days against continuous attack validated his decision to fight rather than surrender when the Japanese first appeared. Commander Winfield Cunningham, the overall American commander at Wake, faced criticism for ordering surrender on December 23rd rather than fighting to the death. However, his decision reflected recognition that further resistance would only increase casualties without changing the tactical situation. The Japanese had landed over 2,000 troops against fewer than 500 effective American defenders, and ammunition for the critical 5-inch coastal guns was nearly exhausted. Continuing the fight would have been militarily pointless and morally questionable, given his responsibility for both military personnel and civilian contractors. The Japanese treatment of Wake Island prisoners violated multiple provisions of the Geneva Convention, though Japan had never ratified the treaty and did not consider itself bound by its restrictions. American prisoners were forced into labor at Japanese military installations throughout the Pacific, working in conditions that caused steady attrition through malnutrition, disease, and industrial accidents. The survivors maintained military discipline throughout their captivity, organizing clandestine communications networks and supporting each other through the hardships that would have broken less cohesive groups. The liberation of Wake Island prisoners in September 1945 revealed the extent of Japanese war crimes committed against the garrison. 98 American civilians had been executed by Japanese forces in October 1943, machine-gunned on Wake Island's beaches in retaliation for American carrier raid on the atoll. The massacre represented one of many atrocities committed against prisoners throughout the Pacific Theater, contributing to the profound bitterness that characterized American attitudes toward Japan during the war's final phase and immediate post-war period. The transformation of American anti-aircraft doctrine between December 1941 and June 1942 represented one of the most rapid tactical evolutions in military history. The inadequacy of 50-caliber machine guns as primary anti-aircraft defense had been obvious from the first hours of Pearl Harbor, but implementing solutions required solving complex problems in weapons procurement, training, and tactical deployment. The success at Midway demonstrated that American forces could adapt faster than their enemies anticipated, turning initial defeats into systematic advantages through superior industrial capacity and institutional flexibility. The 40mm Bofors gun that became the standard medium anti-aircraft weapon for American forces originated in Sweden during the 1930s, designed by A.B. Bofors as an anti-aircraft system capable of destroying fast-moving targets at ranges up to 4,000 meters. The American version, manufactured under license, could sustain firing rates of 120 rounds per minute with each shell weighing nearly 2 pounds and carrying enough high explosive to devastate light structures and personnel within a 10-meter radius. The weapon filled the critical gap between 50-caliber and 5-inch guns that had been so painfully evident at Pearl Harbor. The 20mm Oerlikon cannon supplemented the Bofors by providing even higher rates of fire at shorter ranges. creating an integrated defensive system where attacking aircraft faced continuous fire from detection range through their final attack runs. This layered defense meant that enemy pilots had to penetrate multiple zones of increasingly intense fire, each requiring different attack techniques and exposing aircraft to cumulative damage that reduced their effectiveness even when they survived to deliver weapons. The psychological pressure on Japanese pilots increased dramatically as American anti-aircraft capabilities improved, contributing to declining effectiveness of their naval aviation arm. The statistical analysis of anti-aircraft effectiveness throughout the Pacific War revealed that most aircraft were not destroyed by single catastrophic hits, but by cumulative damage from multiple small-caliber weapons. A Japanese bomber might survive direct hits from several 50-caliber rounds without immediate catastrophic damage, but the accumulated effect of damaged control surfaces, wounded crew members, and disabled systems meant the aircraft could not return safely to its carrier. These mobility kills appeared in Japanese loss statistics as operational accidents rather than combat losses, obscuring the true effectiveness of American anti-aircraft fire. The training programs developed for new anti-aircraft gunners incorporated lessons learned from Wake Island and Pearl Harbor, emphasizing fire discipline, lead calculations, and ammunition management. Gunners learned to track fast-moving targets using standardized procedures that reduce the cognitive load during combat, allowing them to focus on executing basic techniques rather than improvising under pressure. The introduction of standardized training meant that later war gunners achieved competence in weeks that had required months of experience for early war pioneers like Guy McGee and Doris Miller. The Medal of Honor, awarded to Chief John Finn, recognized not only his personal courage, but also the effectiveness of 50-caliber weapons when properly employed by skilled gunners. His citation described actions that exemplified the aggressive spirit and technical proficiency that characterized American anti-aircraft defense throughout the war, maintaining sustained fire despite wounds, improvising weapon mounts under combat conditions, and engaging targets with accuracy that reflected both training and natural aptitude. Finn survived his wounds and continued serving throughout the war, providing first-hand testimony about effective anti-aircraft techniques. The comparative analysis of anti-aircraft effectiveness between Pearl Harbor and later battles revealed the importance of proper weapon positioning, adequate ammunition supply, and realistic training. Ships that had survived Pearl Harbor and received upgraded anti-aircraft armament consistently achieved higher kill ratios in subsequent engagements, not because individual gunners were more skilled, but because the weapons themselves were more appropriate for their intended targets. The 50-caliber machine guns continued providing valuable service as the lightest layer of defense, but they no longer bore primary responsibility for protecting ships against air attack. The Japanese response to improved American anti-aircraft capabilities involved tactical adaptations that reflected their recognition that conventional attack methods were producing unsustainable casualties. The introduction of kamikaze tactics in late 1944 represented acknowledgement that properly defended American ships could not be reliably hit by conventional bombing or torpedo attacks. The suicide attacks eliminated the vulnerability period when aircraft had to escape after delivering weapons, but they also reflected Japan's declining ability to train replacement pilots for conventional operations. The 50-caliber machine guns proved particularly effective against kamikaze attacks because the short engagement ranges meant that every hit contributed to disrupting the pilot's aim during the critical final seconds of the attack run. Ships equipped with dozens of 50-caliber positions could create zones of fire so intense that successful kamikaze attacks required exceptional skill or luck. The psychological effect on American gunners was profound, as they recognized that their fire might not destroy attacking aircraft but could still prevent successful hits by forcing evasive maneuvers that spoiled the pilot's aim. The legacy of Wake Island's defense extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The Marines who fought there became symbols of American determination and tactical competence, their story retold in countless books, films, and commemorations that reinforced national commitment to victory. The civilian contractors who volunteered for weapons training represented the citizen-soldier tradition that defined American military culture, ordinary individuals rising to extraordinary challenges when their nation faced existential threats. Guy McGee's letter to his parents, written in the first week of December 1941, captured the spirit of preparation that characterized the final days before war began. He described his progress with the .50 caliber machine gun, noting proudly that he could now disassemble and reassemble the weapon without leftover parts, and that the gun worked when he put it back together. The simple pride in technical competence reflected values that defined a generation of Americans who approached military service with practical determination rather than martial enthusiasm. The commemoration of Wake Island's defense influenced American popular culture throughout the 1940s and beyond, providing a narrative of heroic resistance that contrasted with the disaster at Pearl Harbor. Films, books, and radio programs highlighted the Marines' tactical victories and refusal to surrender until ordered, creating a mythology that sometimes obscured the complex realities of the actual battle. Nevertheless, the story served its purpose of maintaining morale and reinforcing commitment to unconditional victory against Japan. Doris Miller's Navy Cross and subsequent fame as a war hero accelerated the gradual integration of the United States military, though full equality would not be achieved until President Harry Truman's executive order integrating the armed forces in 1948. Miller's actions at Pearl Harbor demonstrated that racial barriers in military service wasted human potential and reduced combat effectiveness, arguments that gained increasing traction as the war demanded maximum utilization of all available manpower. His death in November 1943, when the escort carrier USS Liscombe Bay was torpedoed, robbed the nation of a powerful advocate for racial justice. The technical evolution of anti-aircraft weapons continued throughout World War II and into the post-war period, driven by the constant arms race between offensive and defensive systems. Guided missiles eventually replaced automatic cannons as primary anti-aircraft weapons, though the .50 caliber machine gun remained in service for close-range defense and other applications, where its reliability and hitting power provided advantages that more complex systems could not match. The M2 Browning, designed in the 1920s, remains standard equipment in the 21st century, testament to fundamental soundness that transcended technological change. The strategic lesson from Wake Island and Pearl Harbor centered on the importance of realistic threat assessment and adequate defensive preparation. American commanders in late 1941 had failed to anticipate the scale and coordination of Japanese attacks, leaving defenses that were adequate against expected threats but completely inadequate against the actual attacks that materialized. The cost of this failure was measured in thousands of lives and months of operational setbacks that might have been avoided through more aggressive defensive preparations. The transformation of .50 caliber machine guns from supplementary anti-aircraft weapons to components of integrated defensive systems represented the American military's remarkable capacity for adaptation under pressure. The institutional culture that emphasized problem-solving over adherence to doctrine allowed rapid implementation of tactical innovations that would have required years in more rigid military organizations. The .50 caliber weapons that had proven insufficient at Pearl Harbor became valuable contributors to defensive success at Midway and subsequent battles when properly integrated with more capable systems. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.